I'd like to again welcome you to today's Reading Together program, Moving Beyond Tragedy. And I think all of us who read Strength and What Remains can attest that Deo Gracias did truly move beyond tragedy, and it was by no easy means that he did this. And so I'd like to briefly introduce this afternoon's very accomplished presenters. If I were going to read all their credentials, we'd be here a long time. So I'm going to just seriously condense their many pages of presentations, publications, certifications, and awards. That there was a trio originally. Their third member had an accident and isn't here today. Olga Bonfiglio, she's currently a professor at K College, and she has a background in intercultural communication and freelance writing. And she did a lot of the blogging and chronicling of your trip, correct?
Olga traveled with us as a journalist.
Right, okay. So that was her part, but she can't be here today. She's recently fallen and on pain meds, so she probably would not.
Could have been entertaining, though.
Yeah.
Father Ken Schmidt is the pastor of St. Thomas More Student Parish here in Kalamazoo, and Sharon Fromm is a pastoral counselor at St. Thomas. They have lots of other jobs and titles too, but I'm not going to get into that because they've been involved in trauma recovery for about 10 years. Okay. And they've both lectured and written extensively on this topic. And they recently traveled to Rwanda, and there they led a trauma recovery workshop, the trauma recovery workshops for priests, medical and school personnel there. And they were so successful that they've been invited back. So let's welcome Father Ken and Sharon.
I'm going to start. Olga was kind of going to do the setup and do a little bit of review of the situation in Rwanda, past and present, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to try to replicate her presentation because I learned she wasn't going to be here at 1 o'clock today. But I will do a little bit of the setup of explaining how we happened to go to Rwanda. And then, as Ken and I decided how to use the time today, we then agreed that at the end it'll allow a little more time than we usually have for questions and answers. And folks generally seem to enjoy that, so I hope that you don't feel like you've been terribly cheated. Ken and I wound up going to Rwanda after I had the occasion to meet Father Ubald. Father Ubald is a Catholic priest in Rwanda, and I was doing a presentation at a conference in San Diego in February of 2010, and he happened to be in attendance. And he approached me at lunch. He asked to eat lunch with me, and in this very noisy dining room, listening to his beautiful but soft accent that's hard to understand, I finally gleaned that what he was saying was, I want you to come to Rwanda. And I want you to work with people on teaching the skills that you've talked about. And as I talked with him further, what my understanding of what he was realizing was that he was trying to help people recover by having them start with forgiveness and with reconciliation as a vehicle for recovery from trauma. And we do it the other way around. We work on skills for recovery, recognizing that forgiveness comes late in that process. And he had helped many people heal and forgive and reconcile, but he also realized there were a lot of people who did not seem to be able to embrace that. And it was the skills that they were missing for being able to regulate feelings and understanding their cognitive distortions and all of the things that we talk about in trauma recovery. And so with him at that conference was a woman named Casey Long, who happened to become part of our team in Rwanda. And after I had met with him for lunch, she approached me later in the day and she said, you need to know that when Father Ubald invites you to Rwanda, that means you're going to come. Do you agree, Sister Marie? You know, Father Ubald, when Ubald has decided, it happens. You know, this is a serious invitation, is what she wanted him to know. So I came back home and I went to Ken and I said, we're going to Rwanda. He says, yeah, right. And I said, no, we're going to Rwanda. And so then I finally convinced him this was a serious invitation. Then we heard from the bishop, Father Ubald's bishop, and got an official invitation. And he kept saying, boy, there's a lot that stands between us and going, you know, like money. And I said, I know, but we're going. And then he kept having this hesitancy, and I said, you need to talk to Casey and understand that we're going to Rwanda. So he did. And he got off the phone from talking with her, and he called me and said, Sharon, I think we're going to Rwanda. We need to, this is a God-driven thing. We need to just get out of the way and let it happen. It was like, yeah. So we did. We wound up raising the money that we needed. And somewhere in the middle of that process of preparation, we realized that when Yuval said we needed to pay our own way, he didn't just mean our own way. He meant we needed to pay for all the participants who attended the trainings. So we had to raise a lot of money to go. And everything, it just truly felt, I don't know what your faith background is, but for us, very God-driven. Like this was supposed to happen, and we just needed to get out of the way of it. And so we went. And one of the things that we were aware of in our preparation is we were not sure how well this model would translate to a culture so far away and potentially so very different from ours. We just didn't know if it was going to work. And what we discovered was the basic framework of the model, the basic content of the model, was embraced totally without any resistance that I'm aware of. Would you agree? Sometimes our examples did not work, however. We had a few surprises along the way. The funniest one was when Ken kind of casually threw out something about AA, and they didn't know what AA was, so then he explained, well, Alcoholics Anonymous, hadn't heard of that. Then when he explained it was where alcoholics helped other alcoholics, there was just this titter. It started as just, a chuckling in the room, and then it became a full-blown belly laugh throughout the whole room. And 15 minutes later, we finally got people pulled back together. The notion of a drunk helping a drunk escaped imagination. I mean, it wasn't something that could easily conceptualize. So that was.
What language did you do it in? Did you need a translator?
Yeah, we had a translator that we assumed would be translated into French. We had all of our materials translated into French, but he translated into Kinyarwanda, which is their native language. And he's in the process of translating the materials in writing into that language. I don't think they'll be ready for when we go back, however. Another example of an example not working was I was talking about, as an example of how somebody might ritualize their recovery, that they might visit the grave of their deceased person and have a conversation with them. And that was not something that was embraced as something that they could comfortably do. So we did trip over some examples that did not apply. But even with those, because we had told them we knew all of our examples might not work, those became vehicles for processing what would work or what would apply. And so having anticipated that actually proved to be productive in facilitating the process of exploring what we were trying to teach. What I'd like to do is give you an overview of the model that we use in working with them, keeping in mind that we do this in 10 weeks, 2.5 hours a week usually, and I'll be doing it in about a half an hour. And then Ken's going to talk very specifically about forgiveness, which is a concept that always is embraced with great vigor when we present this. People are very interested in that concept, especially as we approach it in trauma recovery. I think what would be helpful is for me to start with defining trauma as we talk about it. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about events, an event or a series of events that, not just by themselves, but coupled with the individual's unique vulnerability, result in an injury to mind, body, and spirit. So it's not just what happened, it's also how it lands on the person given what's true about them. So let me give some examples of events. Certainly any kind of abuse, whether it's physical, psychological, emotional. Abandonment, whether it's intentional or unintentional. It could be abandonment by death, divorce, illness, work, being preoccupied. For example, a child may feel abandoned because the parent is out working 3 jobs to keep a roof over their head. And so it's their very best effort to do right by the child, and yet it might constitute neglect from the child's perspective. Being of minority status, whether that's racial or ethnic or religion or gender orientation, whatever that minority status might be. Poverty, war, other kinds of tragedies like natural disasters or injuries. So as I name some of these things, you can recognize that folks who have gone through genocide meet almost all of them. On an objective level, it's about as bad as it can get. Then you look at the issue of vulnerability. One's age. The younger, the more vulnerable. A very small child has limited capacity to see this horrible thing in a positive context. They have a very difficult time having it not be about them. From a child's perspective, it feels like, what's wrong with me that this bad thing's happening to me? So the issue of age is clearly an issue of vulnerability. The duration, the intensity of the abuse or neglect, the relationship of the perpetrator to the person. The more dependent you are on the person, the more likely it's to impact you dramatically. And what else is true in the person's life who is being harmed? What are the other supports? What are the other factors? And then the individual's temperament. Any of you who are parents know that some people enter the universe more resilient than others. Some are more vulnerable than others. So it's the event coupled with these vulnerabilities. What's the relevance to the genocide issue? I can remember in the training, Ken was citing some statistics in our culture about incidents of abuse. And we asked the question, what percentage of people in your country do you think are traumatized? And there was a spontaneous eruption of 100%. In Rwanda, 100% of the people have been traumatized. Certainly if you were born before 1994, and even after, because a lot of this generation is trying to parent without having the benefit of Ben parenting, for one example. And so everyone has been traumatized. It's this issue of how we define trauma. Another example would be, were most of you at Kidder's presentation? A lot of you were. Somebody in the audience asked the question, how has Dale survived this? What he's been through is so dramatic and so significant. How could he possibly survive it? And I think if you look at the things I talked about in terms of vulnerability, you can understand how some survive and some don't. Dale went through his experience, and I only know from what I've read in the book, but with the benefit of a lot of things in place for him. He came from a very supportive and loving family. He had already been competent and successful in his own country. He clearly had social gifts. He was clearly intelligent. And so I'm not trying to minimize what he went through, but he also came out on the other side with the benefit of some things that others in his country may not have had available to them. He knew how to make life work. And so that's part of how he survived. It was what happened on the front end, coupled with what happens after the fact, in terms of being able to recover. Having defined what trauma is, let's talk about what some of the signs of trauma are. And this is one thing that we were curious about. Would the signs be similar from our culture to their culture? And we discovered that they were. One of the signs is out of control or self-injurious behavior. Things like drinking, things like making huge messes in one's life. Employment might be a mess, relationships might be a mess. Self-harming behavior, things like scab picking and cutting and hair pulling and self-injurious behavior. So the self-injurious behavior would be one sign of unresolved trauma. Staying stuck in extreme roles of being a victim, structuring for further victimization would be one sign.